delay, I'm pleased to announce that we're joined by Dr. Chris Englefield. Chris, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us in this Nuclear Security Culture Programme webinar. You might wonder why I'm delivering this webinar, so I thought I ought to introduce myself. I've been lucky enough to have a very wide-ranging career. I started working in the UK's Defence Nuclear Programme, initially on the nuclear submarine refit process and then on nuclear weapons. And then after a few years at the UK's Atomic Weapons Establishment, I left to become a regulator. And I stayed in this role for the rest of my career until retirement in 2014. In that time, I had extensive involvement, obviously, in nuclear regulation, and especially with respect to regulation of radioactive sources. I became a UK representative at the IAEA, initially on safety matters, but at the time I was also leading research and development for the UK's illicit trafficking of radioactive substances programme. And as a result of this, I became drawn into security matters, both in terms of regulation within the UK, but also with UK security agencies, the IAEA and the World Institute for Nuclear Security, or WINS. I was involved in a number of high-profile incidents in the UK, which involved a lot of work alongside various parts of the UK police and security services. And I also spent some years as an emergency planner, where my specialism was incident management. I was lucky enough to be able to retire 7 years ago now and established a consultancy in these matters. And apart from the diversity of technical issues, which I've summarised here, I've been lucky enough to travel the world sharing my knowledge. I'm now honoured to be a visiting research fellow at King's College London since 2017. In that capacity, I've taught on a range of courses concerned with the security of radioactive sources, that's my background. So the scenario I'll be describing today represents the sort of thing that I used to see quite a lot of. And of course, I was part of the learning process that was going on at the time in this country. But over the last 20 years or so, the UK has learnt a lot of lessons, and we have adopted what we find is a rigorous incident management approach. And I'm not trying to sell that approach to you. All I'm saying is, here's what we do in this country. It may be of interest to you. So let's make a start. I've given you some introduction about what this webinar is about, and for some of the radiological safety reasons, I need to give you just a short history of radiological accidents. Well, then I'd like to tell you a story. It's set in the fictional state of Anshar. You may have encountered Anshar before in other webinars with King's College. It's not a happy story. Things didn't go as they should have done. So we'll be looking at questions around what went wrong. And there'll be some reflection on the story, looking in particular at the cultural issues that we can identify in the situation that I'm going to describe. I'll then conclude and finally give you a very brief introduction to what we'll be talking about tomorrow, which is, well, that will become apparent. Helps if you go in the right direction, doesn't it? So as Carl said, we'll be using Mentimeter, an online service, which means that you will need to find, if you can, another device or another window to access Mentimeter. You can use a phone or a computer or a tablet, and it's completely anonymous, as Carl says, so don't be shy. We don't know who's saying or doing what. But let's have a little test, shall we? Can I ask, in your country, how would you say hello? If you go to www.menti.com on your phone, tablet or laptop, it will be asking you to enter a code. Today, the code is 1942 037. And if you would go to that page, I'll pause for a while to allow you time to get there and to make your responses. You probably need a few seconds to find another device. Let's go and have a look and watch the results come in.
Hi Chris, it's Carl. Just on Menti, I think we actually skipped straight to your second question, which is what do you think the most significant effects of malicious use of radioactive sources?
That's interesting. I don't know how that happened. I've got the first one. Technology is wonderful, isn't it?
Technology is wonderful.
Second one. You can see the second one.
I can, yeah, it takes me straight to the second one.
Oh dear, hang on a minute. Let me.
Oh.
Right, yeah, and I can't explain that, Carl, I'm afraid. I will clear it and we'll do it again. We've got some, a couple of responses anyway. Chow and Lee Ho. The test hasn't been quite as successful as I would have hoped, but the question has been answered. I think, we have some more. How's life?
Just say, morning Ali from Turkey. How's your Mentimeter? It's great to see you. How's your Mentimeter? But Mentimeter does work, and we might just have to clear that slide, Chris. But otherwise, I'll hand back over to you.
Yeah, right. Sorry about that. I need to clear the slide. Well, we've got some more. Dirty bomb. Somebody knew that they were anonymous. Reset results. Right, it's basically working. I hope that we'll find when we get to the second slide that it's resynced. Otherwise, there's always going to be a slide out. If this isn't working, then I'll just abandon it, Carl. The idea is to be helpful, not an obstruction. So anyway, let's move on. The point of this webinar, the objectives, is to move from some of the theory which we'll have been encountering with other courses and perhaps with other webinars on security culture, moving from theory a little bit towards practice by focusing on security culture in a real world context. And I've chosen to try and stretch your learning by addressing a national boundary issue instead of the single facility that perhaps you might have been expecting. The idea is that we would like to embed the practical applications of some of the concepts that we discuss. So in addition, I would like to use this webinar to facilitate the sharing of at least good practice, if not best practice, and approaches to physical protection across different organizations, different countries, maybe different regions. The point about this is really to focus on the cultural issues. So in the next 2 sessions over 2 days, I'm going to tell you a story. It's strongly based on true events that I was involved with, but these have been changed to protect the guilty. So this is completely a fictional account. In the first session, it's the tale of a failed security culture that led to a pretty major incident. In the second session, we'll visit what I've called a parallel universe to see how the major incident was avoided, how it could have gone. But before we do that, I'd like just to make sure that everybody has a shared understanding of the basics of the significance of this. We're primarily concerned with the context of a dirty bomb in this webinar, and it's useful to just review some of the background technical material in support of this. Now, it's quite clear, and it will become apparent even tomorrow, that life is never straightforward. Even the best managed organizations make mistakes. Accidents happen. Sometimes, in addition to accidents, there are deliberate acts which cause problems. Now, more often than not, accidental, unintentional events happen, and deliberate acts are extremely rare. So what we can do is use the experience from accidents as an analogue of what might happen in the event of a malicious and intentional incident. Now, fortunately, the IAEA has, over a large number of years now, published many reports on radiological incidents and accidents. You see some examples there, and they're all available to download for free from the IAEA website. So what these radiological incidents show is the sorts of consequences that we might expect from a deliberate act. The problem, as I've already said, is that acts of this kind involving radioactive material are very few in number. Some would say there have never been any. But we can learn quite a lot from these analogous accidents in the reports. In particular, we can learn to appreciate how significant the consequences of different forms of malicious use of radioactive sources could be. And my emphasis over the 2 days will be about consequences rather than initiating causes. So let's try Mentimeter again, fingers crossed, and see if it works. Can you, using Menti again, can you give me your views in a very few words, 1 or 2 only, what you think are the most significant effects of the malicious use of radioactive sources? So once again, if you would go to your device or your other window, menti.com, and enter that code. It's the same code as before. I'm not even sure if you need to enter it again, actually, but enter your responses and we'll have a look and see whether this is working. Excellent. That worked brilliantly. Perception, fear factor, fear, cleanup, long-term stigma, panic and worried. Well, somebody else out there could have written this webinar. No trust in rad sources. There's some really good stuff there. Panic, area denial, induce fear. We're on the same wavelength. You've obviously read the reports. Thank you very much. That's really useful. So as you said, if I can get back to the slide, the real life effects are exactly what you've identified. There's a whole list of them there. I'm not going to repeat them because I think you've identified most, if not all of them. And there are others. This is not an exhaustive list. But the fact is, there's a wide range of potential consequences of this type of accident. And some of these are extremely significant, and arguably the non-radiological effects can have more consequence often than the radiological effects, the actual harm caused to people. That's a moot point, but we haven't got time to discuss that now. There's even some evidence, albeit from nuclear accidents, that public responses like evacuation actually cause more harm than the originating incident. So there's just an example there of a reference which describes the effects of evacuation, long-term evacuation rather than the evacuation process, on a vulnerable population following Fukushima. So making decisions about the best way to address an incident, an accident, an emergency are certainly not straightforward. So all of that is about accidental events. And we can, I think, accept, I hope, that if radioactive sources are used to make a weapon, we can expect broadly similar effects, at least broadly similar effects. So that's exactly the same list again as before. All of the things that we see in accidents are likely to result from malicious use, deliberate use of a radioactive source, the dirty bomb scenario. So this terroristic use of sources is potentially very significant. Interesting, but the number of deaths from this sort of incident are usually, fortunately, very few. It's all the other effects that we're really concerned about. So let's start on the story. I'd like to take you to the fictional state of Anshar. As I say, some of you may have been there before. It has a complex society and economy, and historically, its economy was based on tourism. Its very attractive funicular, in particular, was a great attraction for tourists. But now it has a growing industrial base and economy. And we're going to look at a case of what you might call national security rather than the security of a single facility in Anshar. Increasingly, the economy of Anshar is dependent on industry. It's become quite high-tech. The state of Anshar is a landlocked republic. The capital is Utu, right in the center there. And to the north of Utu is the Larsinian River, one of several which pass through the state. It's a major international trading route. It's the connection for Utu to the sea. And it's the major maritime, in fact, the only maritime import route. And imports come through the neighboring state of Athirat. And I hope you can see that there's a rail network which connects the major port of Plinj to the rest of Anshar. So you can see the rail line that goes from Plinj to the north down to Utu, and then the rail network distributes the trains to the rest of the country, indeed the rest of the region. You may be familiar with the Shapash Nuclear Research Institute to the northeast of Utu. This has the nuclear facilities listed there. Now, one of the things that happens in Anshar is border monitoring. And Customs and Border Control, the Ministry of Finance, have been given the task of operating border monitors to protect the state. They're protecting the state for two reasons. The first one is that there is a steelworks at Molesh. And this is what involved in the usual sort of steel manufacturing processes for rebars, train rails, and so on, but also high-value stainless steel for the whole region, not just for the state. There are a number of scrap yards around the country, and they're feeding this newly developing small-scale manufacturing business, which is becoming increasingly high-tech. Started off with manufacture of furniture and is now going into high-value engineering, centered in Utu. And this niche market is the result of trade deals struck by the president. So he's very proud of all of this. So why do we need to protect the steelworks at Molesh? Well, you may not be aware, but it's not at all uncommon for radioactive sources to enter the steel industry supply chain. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner some examples of radioactive sources. They're small. The biggest of these is probably 5 centimeters in diameter, and they're metallic in nature. And what happens is that steel industrial structures that often include radioactive instruments are sometimes decommissioned and scrapped, either because they've been replaced or because a company's gone out of business. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon for the sources not to be removed as they should be. So the sources become included with scrap metal and are melted for reuse, inadvertently melted. And because of the radiation that they emit, which can be very strong, very harmful, it's possible that, for example, people in the steel industry could be harmed from this. And if the incident is discovered, which is another question in itself, then closure of contaminated production machinery could occur. There have been a number of incidents around the world like this, including in the UK. And as a result of this, sometimes the products, the semi-finished products or the final products, which bear in mind in this country are high-tech, high-value products now, they can become contaminated. So this is a sort of socio-economic issue for the state of Anshar. Now, again, in case you're not aware, the sorts of hazards that might be occurring. I think we all know intuitively that radiation is harmful. In the right hands, of course, it can be really useful for medicine, for research and so on, but most people don't understand how to use it appropriately. So it can cause prompt effects on body tissues such as skin burns, and there's an example on the screen here. And in the longer term, it can cause effects like cancer. So as you've already indicated from your knowledge in Mentimeter, there are various risks to the manufacturing industry which would be harmful to it. So harm to the workforce, harm to customers, harm to the public. As somebody mentioned on Mentimeter, there's the stigma, the blight of raw materials or products. There's immense potential for reputational harm of the companies involved in this manufacturing, indeed anything coming from the state of Anshar. And of course, there are also regulatory risks potentially. The regulators may not be impressed by this and may have a view towards enforcement action. Things like panic, we know from accidents, are very likely to occur, and media attention can be hyped up, amplified enormously, which causes later political and other problems. Very similar to the sort of things that we've been talking about in these other accidents that I've referred to. And these incidents have happened, as I say, many times, in fact, a few hundred times around the world. They're not all at the same scale, but they're known to have happened. However, our primary concern, if we're talking about security, are security issues. And in this context, it's about the so-called dirty bomb scenario. So if radioactive sources are used to make a weapon, we can expect these similar effects. So that's really the two things that we're trying to be aware of and prevent in Anshar. On the one hand, the industrial, commercial and economic impacts of contamination of the supply chain of the increasingly important steel industry. On the other hand, there's the potential use by a terrorist of nuclear materials, radioactive sources in our context, to create all these very harmful effects on the state and the people of Anshar. And this has been a big issue for many governments for 20 years or more. And there's a lot of material from the IAEA and from WINS, which explains some of the concerns and some of the mitigation that's been put in place in terms of controlling security risks. And we use the term dirty bomb rather loosely, and I'm using it very loosely today. The typical scenario is radioactive material strapped to explosives, but these are not the only threat. As a result of this, it's possible that there may be a spread of contamination, or it may be that the attack itself involves simply physically spreading, without the use of a high energy explosive device, contamination around a city or a train network, underground network, or a sports stadium. Or indeed, as has happened, simply strapping radioactive sources to the seats or the vehicles of people that somebody wants out of the picture. So, back to Mentimeter for a moment. Again, if it works. Just to check you're awake, what are the various types of weapons that may be created by malicious users of radioactive sources? Same number again. What do you think are the sorts of things that could be used?
Hi, Chris. For some reason, my Mentimeter isn't.
Is it not?
It's saying, please wait for the presenter to show the next slide.
Right. Okay. Well, I really don't know why that's happening, I'm afraid. I think all I can suggest is I press on.
Or I think if you in the top right-hand corner there's present, I wonder if that would.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go, and that's worked.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. All of the above. Well, one person thinks all of the above. There were 2 people awake. Yep. Well, that's very comforting. There are people who are listening. We've got a small sample, but it does show that there's somebody out there. Let's go back. Right. All of those scenarios were potential applications, malicious applications of radioactive sources. So to prevent these, ANSHA has radiation detectors located on all the major road and rail crossings of the national border. Some of them are only monitoring imports into the state, others are also looking at exports. The locations are only manned part-time. Customs have decided to have intelligence-led campaigns. There's not necessarily a customs presence there because there's free trade between ANSHA and the neighbouring states. So all the detectors report electronically, telemetrically to Customs and Border Control offices in the capital in U2. And the results are checked remotely at 12:30 every day. Customs and Border Control in ANSHA receive quite a generous annual budget of about $20 million equivalent for radiological border monitoring services. You see some of the equipment on the right-hand side at the top. These are channels for vehicles, rail and road vehicles to pass through in front of radiation detectors. The project manager for all this previously worked on the Customs Service Document Management System project. So he's very interested in computing technology. He's learned his trade, having been a lower level manager in the Customs Service. He's now a very experienced project manager dealing with these high-tech issues. He's very conscientious and he always ensures, as a good public servant should, that the budget is spent. He takes pride in his work and makes sure that the investment is made in state-of-the-art equipment. So there's equipment's always being upgraded and the software is being upgraded, and has in his program aspirations to install additional hardware at other transport nodes around the country. So each part of the country has a local officer in charge, and each one of those reports twice per year to the Chief Officer of Customs and Border Control. This is a formal reporting process. The Chief Officer, in turn, always attends an annual meeting with his government department. So he's reporting up the line to his minister, basically. Each time he has this meeting, he fights to have this border monitoring task removed from his responsibilities. He does not like this task. His view is this is not a customs role, it's a safety role, and his organisation shouldn't be doing it. So after the meetings, he briefs his staff, and he's always proud to tell them he's fighting their corner. And every year, he sets out to shift this task to someone else, anyone else, basically. It's not a role, in his view, for Customs and Border Control as a service. So as I said, the porter monitors are switched on, but they're not normally staffed. And they do detect things from time to time, and they have been quite successful at detecting naturally occurring radioactive materials of norm. So things like orange juice, bathroom ceramics, and even tobacco have been detected from by this equipment, but nothing more sinister than that. Each time something is detected, Customs and Border Control call out SNRI, the Shapash Nuclear Research Institute, to investigate it for them. But it's been fairly rare, very quick events, just showing that something pretty innocuous has been detected, like orange juice. It's the potassium 40 in the orange juice, which is very detectable, and very quickly Shapash staff, SNRI staff, can go back to their day job instead of responding to this minor incident. So let's try Mentimeter again, and usual process. Anything you'd like to say at this point? Do you have any concerns? Just a word or two, 10 at the most. Just enter anything which, if there is anything, which is beginning to make you feel a little uncomfortable. I'm feeling uncomfortable, but I know what's going to happen. So is there anything at all? I'll give you a little while to think and respond. Ah, interesting. A black swan event. How right you are. Complacent. That's a good word. Thank you for that. A black swan event is something completely unforeseen, completely unexpected. Complacent seems to be coming up quite a lot. Chief has a poor attitude. Excellent stuff. Yes, he certainly does. Wrong attitude, not taken seriously. It's good, this Mentimeter, isn't it? This is a very dynamic way of getting feedback. Everything seems okay. Well, yeah, it does seem okay. I agree. Absence of clarity, lack of leadership. Excellent. Excellent. Right, let's go back. All of those points that you've raised are completely valid. Thank you for staying awake, basically. So things are starting to warm up now. It's the 18th of May, 2021, and a train left the port of Plinge at 5:30 in the morning. The equipment was found at the regular check at 12:30 to have detected a strong signal from this train. There's a duty officer that checks it every day. And for those of you that are interested in these things, it's a very characteristic signal. That's the energy spectrum of cobalt-60. And cobalt-60 is something which is a danger to the public. It's a strongly penetrating gamma radiation, and the dose rates could be very high. It could be very dangerous. It isn't necessarily so, but we don't really know very much yet. And the concerns are, if you remember, that this source could be melted with steel scrap and go into the supply chain for the high-tech industry, which is of such significance for the country, or it could be of use to a terrorist for a dirty bomb. But we simply don't know what, if any, motivation is behind this. It might be a purely accidental movement, or it could be a terrorist trying to smuggle something in. We have no idea at this stage. So the train has left the port and entered the rail network. At 12:30, when the signal is recognized and assessed in U2, it's known very quickly that the train has been reconfigured into 5 other trains at a depot in the suburbs of the capital in U2. Most of these have already left that depot in all directions. So this is a rhetorical question, but what does the customs service officer do next? He's not going to be happy. He's not going to be comfortable. He should be asking himself, well, which trucks are involved? If it's a single truck, where's it going? Where are they going? Who do I tell about this? Where are the legal powers to do anything? Who has the power to stop a train? Who's in charge? Am I in charge? Am I going to be responsible for managing this for the whole of the state? I don't feel at all comfortable about that. What are the safety issues? Are there safety issues? Is it dangerous? I don't know. I don't know anything about radiation. What are the security issues? Could this be something to do with terrorists or not? How do I tell? Who do I inform about this? What about telling the public? Should I tell them so they can take action? Or should I not tell them so they don't panic? What are the media issues? Should we keep this out of the media? Should we keep this quiet? This is a very, very challenging situation for the poor guy or girl who has been given the task of checking this equipment. Immediate high levels of stress, very challenging indeed. But let's not go any further. Let's stop. Let's stop and try and regain control, because we're not going to go into the details, the nitty-gritty of all of this. That's not the point. The point of this is to stop and reflect on what's happened and why. In the real thing, the chaos of all of this lasted for days. So I'm very much summarizing and compressing this, and I'm not able to give you any realistic impression of the time scale. But this was a very long duration event. The sorts of responses that happened in the first few hours were from a number of stakeholder organisations, including different police forces. So the Capital Police, the U2 City Police, wanted to know why they weren't told immediately. The poor customs guy didn't know. He had to tell them. There's River Police in Anshar. The river, if you remember, was the route by which the sources were imported, so they have jurisdiction. They're saying, well, were there others? Could they have gone on through the river to other places? The company that operates the port is very concerned because they've heard in the 2 or 3 days after the incident that the authorities want to shut the port while everything is being investigated. But the port is absolutely pivotal to the economy of the country and, of course, the success of the company that runs it. And the U2 Mayor's Office is also absolutely furious about all of this. They've been told they can't be given any information about the rumours they've heard of a radioactive source being lost within the country. They are told that they can't have any information because it's national security. The mayor is not impressed. This is rubbish. He should be told. Why hasn't he been told? The train operating company feels their staff may have been at risk. How can they help if they're not told about it? They were kept out of the loop. And the Anshar Security Service had been aware that there was a possibility of a dirty bomb threat. Why weren't they told this was happening? It took 2 or 3 days. At which point Interpol became involved because there are international implications. And the media started to become involved. CNN wanted a statement. SNRI, the Shapash Nuclear Center, had been dispatched by Customs to investigate, but they wanted more information from Customs. They wanted to know who's in charge. Is it really this young manager, the duty officer? Is it known if there's any terrorist involvement? What is the threat assessment for the country? Is there something they should know? Can't tell you that, says Customs. It's a national security issue. You need a security clearance. A security clearance takes at least 3 weeks in Anshar, at least. So SNRI want to know how many people live along the rail routes. They want to plan their response from the medical point of view and plan where to put teams to support medical staff. They want to know who to contact in the national rail operating company. And they need to know who has the powers to stop these trains. They're used to having coordination of media arrangements. Who is coordinating? Well, no one's thought of that. And inevitably, they want to know, this is going to go on for a while. Who's going to pay? Who's going to pay for our costs? This is the list of organizations which, as it were, came out of the woodwork. They appeared without any prior knowledge that they would have an interest in this in the first 48 hours after this incident occurred. There's a long list. I'm not going to go through it. But one of the reasons I'm not going through it is that it's actually a longer list. as time went by, more and more organizations expressed an interest as they heard rumors, and organizations like the media, the IAEA, and a satirical TV show called The State of Anshar also started to lampoon, to mock the government for their poor organization of this response. So all of these organizations appeared, and no one had given any thought to the fact that any of these might be involved. Now, the outcome of all of this was that the consignment was eventually tracked to the border crossing with the adjacent state of Naboo. And SNRI identified that the signal was coming from one particular ISO container. There's a picture of it there. And they were able eventually to enter the container under controlled conditions. And they found at the front of the container, there was a drum full of brass fittings. There's a picture of it there, which included inadvertently a cobalt-60 source, which had probably at one stage been in a teletherapy machine. So it was medical origin. Now, to compress all this, for the time we have available, the costs of remediation and waste disposal for all of this were put at $1.1 million US. Fortunately, the company that owned the shipment that it was heading towards came forward pretty promptly when they heard that this had happened, and they offered to pay for the disposal of the source. They would get their own radioactive waste management contractor in, and then they could keep the rest of the consignment and everything would return back to normality. So this was pretty unusual, but for once somebody appeared to be taking responsibility. Now, other consequences of this were that eventually the Customs Service Chief Officer lost his job and his pension. But his successor set about changing things, and we'll hear more about her tomorrow. Things were going to improve. All the stakeholders, but particularly SNRI, were called to provide technical advice to a formal investigation. And it actually was concluded that there had been no terrorist involvement. It was an accidental scenario, and there was no evidence of overexposure to radiation to anybody in the public, the port, or rail staff. And the source had been detained. So in that respect, it was arguably successful. It was also concluded in the formal investigation that there was no way to stop this becoming known to the media. There are always leaks. And it was pointed out that things could have been a lot worse. There could have been a huge impact on the technology sector of the state of Anshar if this material had got into the supply chain, and these high-tech new industries, which were the pride of the president, the pride of the country, had been blighted. Not to mention the impact on the still significant but traditional tourism sector. So there were lots of things that could have gone worse. There could have been deaths, and the health service could have been overwhelmed, much as we've seen in the accident scenarios. So from that point of view, you could say, well, relatively successful. But actually, it was later found that the reason that the consignee, the person to whom this scrap metal had been heading, the reason they'd stepped in and accepted all the costs was because it seemed likely from intelligence that there was something else hidden in the ISO container. It was entirely accidental that the source was there, but scrap was ostensibly the consignment, but it seemed likely from police intelligence there was drugs being smuggled in the same container. So this was a lost judicial opportunity. There was no potential for following up the drug smuggling situation. So, just looking at the way this incident was managed, what's your view about who's contributed most to the creation of these problems? So you can go back to Mentimeter. Usual process, same code. Who is my problem here is I'm forever moving the
So I think if you click onto the slide.
Yeah, I've got it now, I think.
Marvelous.
Here we go. Any views? Clearly, they've all made a contribution. It's entirely a matter of opinion about this. The president seems to be doing quite well out of it. There's no right or wrong. I accept what you say. A number of people certainly take the view that all of them have been responsible. The chief officer seems to be the guy who's coming off worst as things are developing. Let's just wait a couple more seconds, see if there's any more changes. Okay, let's go back. My view is it is the chief officer, but actually have all made a contribution. So, you know, it's just a matter of opinion. I would say that the chief officer provided very poor leadership in that he didn't accept ownership of the task. His main concern was to be rid of the task, not to be involved. He didn't show the leadership to his staff to accept the role. He encouraged them to rebel against it and to put in place the bare minimum response arrangements. He had no concern about making sure that his responsibility was effective. He was just concerned about being discharged from this responsibility. But even this very conscientious program manager, he was overly focused on having the best technology, buying the best equipment, and using up his budget. And the president, the chief officer should have spent more time ensuring that his program manager was effective and not just focusing on buying the equipment that he found so fascinating. So the chief officer wasn't leading by example. He hadn't created an effective culture. But also, in terms of poor leadership, neither had the president or his officials done anything to help. The president wasn't contributing either. His government must have been aware of the dispute between departments. This was an annual event where the chief officer would complain about having this task and wanting to shift it onto somebody else. But the president and his officials did nothing to resolve it. And that's hardly satisfactory. It certainly contributed to the lack of preparedness. So, what can we conclude from all of this? Well, it's clear there was no foresight. There was no ability to predict what could happen or what would be needed in the future. There was no plan. Nobody had anticipated that an incident like this could actually occur. Customs were not ready. They didn't even know which organisations might need to be informed of this. This complete lack of foresight was very unprofessional, very inappropriate. Foresight comes from having grown expertise, and expertise, in my view, comes from practice. Now, one form of practice is what we call exercises, rehearsals, and there was no sign of any exercises or practices of response for any sort of situation vaguely resembling this in the state of Anshar. They were simply not prepared. So strategically, they were unprepared. The leadership was ineffective. They weren't putting any effort into what we'll discuss tomorrow, which is preparedness. Managerially, there was no effort at any level within the customs organisation to ensure readiness. There was inadequate supervision of the key roles of the project manager and indeed of the chief officer. Culturally, there was no sense of values. There was no wider teamwork or any sign of a positive attitude towards continuous improvement. Now, tomorrow I'll explore these in more detail, but these are cultural deficits that really need to be involved in situations that occur in our modern world. So tomorrow we'll look at how most of these issues we'll look at how most of these issues could have been avoided with some preparedness. Preparedness is the state of being prepared, readiness. So basically, that's all I want to say for today. What I've tried to do is to paint you a picture of chaos, of poor incident management. Anything which could go wrong did go wrong because there was effectively no incident management. There was no response plan in place. So that's enough for today, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Over to you, Carl.
Thanks, Chris. That was fascinating. Very calming voice you have as well. So we have 2 questions so far on the chat. If you have any questions, please do use the chat function, the Q&A function, to put those through. But Chris, the first question, and I think this question was probably asked as you were going through your slides, but it says you mentioned the principles applying to nuclear incidents. Could you briefly mention to what extent the principles you were talking about apply to nuclear and radiological incidents? That's from Anonymous. If you wanted any clarity on that, please do add that in.
Well, can I just check first of all that you can still see everything okay? My screen did something unexpected.
Oh, we just see you at the moment, no slides.
Yeah, no, okay, that's fine. So the principles, well, the trouble is to go through all the principles would take at least another hour. But the point is, I think, first of all, we'll be looking at some of these tomorrow. And that's the point of the seminar tomorrow. I think the main thing I would say here, the principle I'm trying to get across, is that if the culture is right, then at least a national approach to managing incidents, radiological or nuclear, will be in place. In my experience, having traveled quite widely on business in this sort of area for the last 20 years or so, there are still many countries where, not just for radiological incidents, but for many types of serious events which can happen, which have potential for causing harm, there is no preparedness, there's no preparation. So there's no realistic ability to manage a response to an incident. As we'll see tomorrow, it's not credible, feasible to manage a response once it happens. And one of the things I'm trying to get across tomorrow is the idea, first of all, of practice, as I've already discussed, but also of having in place an infrastructure which ensures that all the relevant organisations have been identified, that all the risks have been identified, and that measures have been put in place. But to balance that, what I would say is that I was astonished in my career, having gone through nearly 30 years in the job. You get to the stage where you think, well, you've seen it all, you know, nothing new can happen, but it does. And no one has the foresight to anticipate everything. There will always be things which are unexpected. And I'm astonished, even today, having been retired, you know, just watching the television news, things still happen which you couldn't have anticipated. Now, if the right sort of preparation is in place, that can be responded to effectively. But it certainly won't be if that effort hasn't been put in. So that's what we'll be looking at tomorrow.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. We've got another question here from Olu. But in a country or group of countries connected by porous borders, how would regulatory measures be ensured, or what not all countries have the benefit, I think, of being an island like the UK, or having radiation portal monitors. So where there is porous and where there's traffic coming through, is there a particular approach, or does it come down to preparedness and responding when an incident comes, being reactive?
That's a very interesting question. It's the one thing that I haven't addressed tomorrow, and that I haven't chosen to make an example of. But the principles come down to the same thing, as you say, Carl, is preparedness. The UK, I probably shouldn't go into too many details, but most people will be aware that the UK comprises England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And although these are all part of the same state, the United Kingdom, there are differences, regulatory differences between the various parts of the UK. And what's been done, and it's taken quite a long while, is policy has been developed to enable things to move from one part of the UK to another. And to some extent, and certainly when it comes to things like transport of radioactive sources, international arrangements are in place with common standards to ensure that things run appropriately and smoothly in terms of crossing borders. And all it comes down to is for states involved to sit down with each other and agree. And that might start at the political level and then move on to officials for the purposes of developing policy. But if you haven't done this, when something happens, then it's going to be chaos. And right at the start of my career, we had Chernobyl in 1987, I think it was, 87, 86. And that's a really good example of nothing having been prepared anywhere, because no one had foreseen the accident at Chernobyl. And the creation of international agreements and international cooperation about things like airliners moving from, for example, I don't know, Japan or New Zealand coming back to the UK, or indeed flights in progress when Chernobyl happened. None of that had been done. None of that had been thought through. And it all had to be done initially, as we would say, on the hoof, done in real time, pretty much. But over the following 20, 30 years, it was developed to a much higher level. And that comes down to organizations like the IAEA, the United Nations, and bilateral and international relationships. So that's way above my pay grade, but it's the sort of thing that has to be identified in order to be resolved. And by focusing on consequences rather than on the causes, the same negotiations could be used for something like, say, in principle, coronavirus, as used for radioactive sources, because some level of agreement, some level of protocol can be negotiated, which is about something harmful moving from one country to another by air, moving very quickly, or by sea. So to finish off this point, a good example, mushrooms. Following the Chernobyl accident, there was concern about the fact that mushrooms have an ability to cling on to radioactive material in the atmosphere. And consequently, when they're harvested and transported internationally, there is the potential for radioactive materials to enter into the food chain. International negotiations within the European Union put in place measures to protect the public from that sort of effect. That's all I'm going to say. It's just one example. So it's about being prepared and having an organizational culture and a national culture which says we need to cooperate, we need to collaborate within the country and internationally.
No, thanks, Chris. And to one country, but also their immediate neighbours at least. If there's porous traffic, you can go either way. So yes, there's a clear mutual benefit.
Absolutely.
There.
But there are, I mean, there are still countries in the world that tend not to do that, which is, let me say, at least unfortunate. And I would go so far as to say ignorant, because something someday is going to happen. We don't know what, which causes them a problem. And it's a cultural issue. It needs to be resolved. to protect the citizens.
No, thank you, Chris. And I think we're just going to have our last question here, a question from Artem. But just in the scenario, there was an international dimension. And currently there's no legal obligations on states to report the loss of control of dangerous radioactive sources. The ITDB is voluntary, or International Trafficking Database, illicit trafficking database. Sorry. Yeah. Is there any work done in that regard, or what would you suggest to states about reporting work?
I think if you look at policy arrangements which exist between regulatory bodies in Europe, which I probably know most about, then there are arrangements, there are protocols in place. At the wider international level, the IAEA's International Emergency Centre functions in a similar sort of way to provide coordination for international notifications and indeed providing assistance in the event of incidents like this. So I think there are policy arrangements in place. It's true that there's nothing binding. The only binding things I'm aware of, I think, are within the European Union. There may be others, but I'm not aware specifically. And I think the point is, if you use the facilities which are there, such as the IEC in the IEA, it will be enormously helpful. The only thing I would say is that, and this is very much a personal view, so not everyone will agree with me, but I think it's important for every state to keep in mind the difference between its own responsibilities to regulate things within its own border and its responsibilities to neighbouring states, or at least states it's connected to through international trade, to notify them of things. So the definition of material out of regulatory control, as you referred to it, is really important here. And my view is, if it's moving within a country, there's no need to report it internationally. But if there's any possibility at all of it moving internationally, then it's absolutely right to report it to the IAEA for the illicit trafficking database, and any other, like ECURI in the European Union, any other reporting channel that's been in place. But regulators and operators in particular have the primary responsibility. Operators are responsible first and foremost, and regulators should not be seen perhaps to be apparently divesting themselves of responsibility by trying to report everything that happens in their state internationally. It's important that the things that are transmitted are the things that matter, and not that there's a danger of those things being obscured by all the background noise if everything is reported. And there has been in the UK a tendency to over-report, perhaps sometimes, a personal view.
Excellent, thank you, Chris, that's very clear. Thank you so much for your time today. I realise we're kind of just over the hour now, so thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. So Chris, we're looking forward to seeing you again same time tomorrow.
Or tomorrow, yeah.
Or tomorrow. So looking forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you so much for your questions and your inputs in Mentimeter.